do what I can do. So I want to talk a bit about the conservation authorities, the history of the conservation authorities, some of the challenges we're looking at. And really, Jack said a lot of the things very well. In Ontario, we have conservation authorities. They are based on a watershed basis, and they came about because of problems in the 30s and 40s, and an understanding that if you worked on a watershed basis, you could get cause and effect together and understand things holistically. The objectives of authorities are to properly safeguard people, to manage the watersheds and restore them, to restore woodlots, wetlands, and habitats, to maintain programs that will help people because of hazards, and give people the opportunity to experience nature, because without that, they are not going to appreciate or value it. I'm not going to go over this because Andrew did, but conservation authorities are the only agencies in Ontario based on watersheds. Now I'm going to take you back to 1945, in 1944. Conservation authorities came about because of the Guelph Conference. At this conference, you had a whole bunch of different agencies, all the way from legions members to environmentalists, to forest engineers, which foresters were called back then. And they came up with the idea that to address many of the environmental problems, and also the issue of soldiers coming back from the war and needing work, look at watershed planning. They looked at the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Muskingum projects, and they decided that's where we needed to go with resource management. In the Ganaraska, which is one of the first, the way they did that is they had meetings with the people. And behind this is a photocopy of a meeting in 1945. 350 enthusiastic people went to the Orange Hall in Pontypool to discuss starting a conservation authority. And although you can't see it here, they had a dance, and they had 250 people dancing at the end of the meeting. That's a good conservation authority start. The founding principles of conservation authorities, and these principles I think will bring us through. You can maybe consider we've lost a little bit of this as we've gone along, but first, watershed based. That's our strength. Second, we never spend money without 4 or 5 pots coming together, and that's called partnerships. And that's absolutely critical to what watershed management success looks like. And finally, local initiatives. You need to get people to care for their watershed and deal with it. One of the concepts, and there's different pictures of some of the challenges in the Oak Ridges Moraine. One of the concepts is that in a conservation authority, the municipalities that have land within that watershed get together to make that watershed better. Now, whether or not we're doing that well, that's always questionable, but that is the overall guiding things. And it's because we had environmental degradation. A lot of challenges as we moved from a very agrarian society. People moved off really marginal lands. It formed the basis of many of the county and conservation authority forests and the restoration efforts that came about at the start. But what's important to remember is it started with watershed planning. This is the Ganaraska Watershed Report, was completed in 1944. It is absolutely a holistic approach. One of the things, and if you're ever interested in looking up somebody, there's a guy by the name of Virgil Benson Blake. He is considered the father of community histories in Ontario. He wrote sections of all these watershed reports. So for every conservation authority, a watershed study was conducted, talking to the people, doing science, and understanding what challenges there were in the watershed. Now, this is not a document that stays still. Many of these original documents in the Lower Thames, it dates to 1961, but they have been replaced many times as understandings, as challenges changed over time. And there was, in the Ganaraska, they built the Ganaraska, they planted the Ganaraska forest. On the left bottom, you'll see that forest, one of the most significant, I think, environmental achievements in Southern Ontario in the last 100 years. But there's decades of watershed management, all the way from stewardship with guys with really baggy pants to building dams, to creating and holding natural areas, and also even forest management in the big forests that came about because of conservation authorities. Now, I'm going to go through a bunch of slides of what the Conservation Authority did, our Conservation Authority did. This is from 2021. So flood forecasting, a big piece, and monitoring flooding and erosion. So a lot of effort goes not only in providing advisories, but continue the monitoring so we can learn about processes of erosion, processes of flooding, causes of flooding. And in the Thames River in particular, we are seeing climate change is having a significant effect in the river's response. Last fall, we had a major flood, unlike what we have seen in many, many years. And we believe it's because of a changing climate. But we also look at water quality. We do a lot of monitoring. These are just the provincial programs we have, and some of this is because of phosphorus reduction programs. But we're doing a lot of work, not only in gathering data, but analyzing it, and then subsequently synthesizing that data with what else we know about the watershed to guide what we do in a stewardship and a management perspective. We are involved in land use planning. These are the numbers from last year, but also important is the almost 2,000 phone calls that we talked to people about what they were doing on their land and encourage them to do the right thing for the watershed. So in stewardship, last year, the Lower Thames worked with almost 450 landowners undertaking projects. When you look at the 41 acres of wetlands, most of those are 1 and 2 acre wetlands. So the amount of engagement with the community and the amount of work, and what we find is if a person does work on their watershed, on their land, they become a proponent for improving the watershed, not only on their land, but across the watershed. We work with species at risk. The Thames River has some really neat stuff in it, including mussels and other fish species. And we are continuing to work with communities, and we worked on McGregor Creek with a number of landowners to remove water lattice. So once again, lots of work. The Lower Thames is, the bottom part of the Lower Thames is very, very agriculture, 3% forest cover, the rest is farmed. And we have major farm programs. We are one of the few conservation authorities that actually have an agricultural specialist on staff. And we are working with landowners to improve soil health. So we are trying to look at all the different pieces of the puzzle, because we believe health of soil is health of watershed as well. And this gives you an idea of some of the major programs. The McGregor and Jeanette's Creek projects are where we've gone into sub-watersheds, identified specific targets, are working for phosphorus reduction. You can see that last year we had 10,000 acres of cover crops that we helped fund. So a lot of work. Now, I was talking about partnerships. It goes two ways. Not only do we ask people to partner with us, we partner with them and try to improve their ability to produce what they produce. So in our watershed, Alice Middlesex, Alice Chatham-Kent, Alice Elgin, they are actually sponsored by our authority to help move their programs into our watershed communities. That watershed program is a project whereby the farmers actually work in a committee to define what funding should go to farmers in not only doing things, but also providing rent money for taking land out of agriculture and putting it into environmental purposes. We have lots of conservation areas. Our authority doesn't actually have as many, and probably it's because we have so much agriculture. But once again, it's because we are unique. Every authority is unique to its watershed. And therefore, you're going to have things that are unique to that watershed. In our watershed, we have a reconstructed Haudenosaunee village. We have 4 nations in our watershed, 4 First Nations in our watershed that are incredibly important to the long-term health and understanding of what we do and how we restore our watershed. So we work very closely with those nations to move things forward, not only to move things forward from Western science, but to learn traditional ecological knowledge that helps us better understand, and also better feel of what, get a better feel of what our watershed's all about. And we also celebrate people. Really important part of a conservation authority. Every year we celebrate groups that support and move things forward. So last year we gave over $1 million out to landowners to restore the watershed. These are an example of a number of the organizations we worked with, but it's absolutely critical that watershed planning and those three ideas of that I came up with at the start, which the local initiative piece is how you make it happen. Now, I want to talk very shortly about First Nations in the watershed and watershed planning. So we, a number of years ago, with the First Nations there were 8 First Nations involved at the start of the project, started the Thames Clear Water Revival Project. And it was to bring not only conservation authorities, but local governments and other levels of government with First Nations together to improve the watershed. It is our newest version of the Thames River Watershed Plan. And we created what was called the Shared Waters Approach, which is the watershed plan. And it's very specifically shared waters because it is a sharing between First Nations that live on that in that watershed and settler communities to come up with a two-eyed seeing approach that is appropriate for our watershed. It strengthens the goals of the watershed plan and it provides depth. One of the things that plan did is that the First Nations actually brought forward proposals for goals for the watershed that were specific to the development and ensuring that Indigenous traditional knowledge had been incorporated in the program. And those are the first one, very important, formalizing the process where the spirit of water is recognized, and then involving and improving awareness of First Nations communities. So I'm getting to the end now. What are the challenges? One of the things is watershed plans need to be updated. They need to respond to new science. They need to respond to things like First Nations traditional knowledge. They need to respond to communities. And one of the challenges is getting the money to do that. In the province defining mandatory programs for us, they're taking us away from those original principles, which is watershed-based, holistic approaches to watershed science, including the whole watershed in the approach of improving it. I keep saying, if you don't manage the watershed, you can never build a dike big enough to hold up the flood that will come downstream. And even though the mandatory programs are around flooding, watershed management is the only sound way of managing flooding as well. Climate change is a potential of putting some real challenges, and we need to understand that by understanding and improving the science that we continually work on. And First Nations need to be included in watershed, and we need to look at this as an opportunity, not as a challenge in many ways. It's an opportunity for us to learn and to do really good work. One of the challenges at one time, the shared funding piece that I talked about in 1940 was all about 50% provincial funding, 50% municipal money. Last year, our budget was $3.5 million, and we got $80,000 from the province in our base grant. So that has meant that conservation and most of the other money came from municipalities. So it means that where there aren't municipalities that can afford a conservation authority with full programs, that means that there's a varying capacity across the province for that. We need to look at a model where there's an evening out of resources so that we have good watershed management. Every watershed needs work. Every watershed needs work. We have financial constraints, and the final one is urbanization. It will change everything. When the conservation authorities came about, it was about abandoned farmland. It's now about watersheds with significant urbanization. And how do we maintain integrity of streams under that? Thank you very much.